Morning. Thank you for being here. I want to get started because I always like to have our scholars finish their opening remarks and allow for at least half the time for questions from all of you. Appreciate your being here. I'm Mike Van Dusen, Executive Vice President of the Center. You have the bios of our four speakers. I won't get into that. We're going to be looking at some development and security issues this morning. The lead speaker is Cindy Arnson, who's Director of the Latin American Program at the Center. Each speaker will take 8 minutes, and then we will get to questions. Cindy.
Mike, thanks, and thanks to all of you. What I'd like to do is give you an overall feel of support for democracy in Latin America, and then show in places where there is less support for democracy what factors most influence that level of dissatisfaction. I think that overall, if you look at South America, there's a great deal of satisfaction about the ways in which the emergence from the recession was much quicker and faster than the United States or other places in the developing world, in the developed world. That there have been growth rates over the last 2 years that are approximately double that of the United States. High prices for commodities, the demand from China for commodities produced in Latin America, both energy and minerals and food, have been sort of the drivers of that robust growth. Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean, the economies that are most tied to the United States, obviously are an exception to the pattern in the rest of South America. So what I'd like to do is show these basic indicators in the region and also some of the vulnerabilities. First, there's a lot of good news to report. The Latin American polling firm, thank you, Latino Barometro, shows that overall support for democracy in Latin America is the highest that it's been in the last decade. Slightly lower than in the late 1990s, perhaps by about 2%. In the year 2010, fully 61% of citizens in the region agreed with the statement that, quote, democracy is preferable to all other forms of government. Now, there are some surprising results when you break that down by country. The highest levels of support, 84%, were in Venezuela, a country where we know that liberal democracy and democratic institutions are under assault. The lowest level of support for democracy was found in Guatemala, where only 46% of the population agreed that democracy is preferable to any other form of government. Now, when the question is put slightly differently, the results are still basically the same. An average of 77% of Latin Americans agreed with the statement, quote, democracy may have its problems, but it's the best system of government, unquote. And that's a sort of formulation that's attributed to Winston Churchill. Not surprisingly, a country like Uruguay, with high levels of social development, fully 91% of Uruguayans believe or basically agree or strongly agree with that statement. Again, Guatemala at the bottom, only 59%. And I'll just mention the 8 countries in the region that fall below the average for Latin America. And I think you'll, when you think about levels of poverty and institutional development, you'll understand why. Those countries were Bolivia, Honduras, Nicaragua, Peru, Paraguay, Mexico, in the midst of a terrible fight against drug cartels, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Now, here's where things get a little bit more interesting. According to Latino Barometro, there is a significant and basically going back as far as 1995, a permanent gap between those who support democracy and those who are satisfied with it. Those of you who have done undergraduate or graduate work in political science know that that scholars of democratic governance have focused on issues of the quality of democracy and the so-called desencanto, the disenchantment with the actual performance of democratic regimes and distrust, widespread distrust of political leaders, parties, institutions, etc. And the results of this poll based in Chile reflect that. Only 44%, less than half of Latin Americans, characterize themselves as very satisfied or even fairly satisfied with democracy. And the levels who report themselves as dissatisfied have declined since 1995, but still in 2010, 52%, over half of the citizens polled, described themselves as unsatisfied with the functioning of democracy in their country. There's another set of data produced in the United States called the Americas Barometer, run by the Latin American Public Opinion Project, based at Vanderbilt University. The LAPOP survey found that, as Latin America emerged from the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression, democratic attitudes and the legitimacy of the political system overall were surprisingly resilient. There was very little change in support for democracy between 2008 and 2010, at a time when GDP was declining and more people were being cast into poverty. The satisfaction with democracy also didn't change much between these 2 years, 2008 and 2010, but there were major increases in 3 places, and those places were Honduras, post-coup Honduras, El Salvador after the victory of the FMLN of Mauricio Funes, the candidate of the FMLN, and in Paraguay after the election of the opposition candidate Fernando Lugo. Then the Americas Barometer goes further than Latinobarometro in breaking down or trying to correlate the different factors that account for satisfaction with the idea of democracy. So when you're looking to determine who is it that supports the idea of democracy, it's people who are satisfied with the current president and have a positive perception of the economic performance of the government, which goes to the development theme that we're talking about today. People with higher levels of education. Again, more education, higher support for democracy. People who are wealthier in the higher quintiles of income distribution. Older people and people in urban areas. Now, you can break this down even further. What are the kinds of things that influence or impact support for the political system? By support, what do we mean? Do people think that the political institutions of the country work well? Do you think citizens are guaranteed a fair trial, or are they well protected? The issues that most negatively impact on support for democratic systems are unemployment, temporary unemployment, being a victim of crime, being victimized by corruption, and perceiving that your country is insecure. And again, there are differences between the perception of violence and actual levels of crime and violence, but the perception also erodes support for democracy. I'm running out of time, so I don't want to, I'll just go quickly because I think there's some other interesting correlations that come out. When you ask people about support for the rule of law, in other words, if you ask the question, in order to catch criminals, should authorities always abide by the law, or should they occasionally cross the line? Only 60%, I mean, again, it's a majority, but only 60% of Latin Americans said that authorities should always obey the law. The highest percentages for the support of rule of law were in places such as Brazil, Venezuela, Belize, but in Peru, El Salvador, Ecuador, fewer than 50% of the population thought that authorities should always abide by the law. And as in the issue of support for the democratic system, the two variables that are most consistently correlated with low support for the rule of law are having been the actual victim of a crime or having a perception of insecurity. I'm going to stop there because I think the lessons from these polls and the correlations that they're able to build have fairly obvious consequences or conclusions for the strengthening of democracy. If you want to strengthen democratic governance and support in Latin America for not only democratic systems but for the idea of democracy, you have to resolve issues of unemployment, you have to resolve issues of crime and violence, and you have to do much to overcome the perception of citizen insecurity that's rampant in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. And because of that, one of the big things that Cindy works on is programming on citizen security. The second speaker is Jeff DeBalco. Dr. DeBalco is the director of our program on environmental change and security. Jeff.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, everyone. As Mike said, working with a couple communities that don't always talk with one another: environment, natural resources, climate change, and development, foreign, and security policy. And in many ways, this panel has been set up to bring some of these different worlds together. And so I'll make my remarks on some of the some of the challenges, but also some of the imperatives for us working across these communities. So a required first step to do this, we have found from having 16 years of meetings on these topics at the Wilson Center, is that we all must really kind of check our stereotypes of the other communities at the door. And so what that means is when I'm talking about environment and natural resources, I don't want you to have the image of the young idealistic kid wrapping his arms around a redwood or trying to do so, right? We're not talking about hugging trees and hugging pandas. We're talking about natural resources as critical ingredients of the livelihood strategies of literally a few billion people in the world. And so this is, in many respects, it's high politics. It needs to be front and center on our development and our foreign and our security policy. And it's the need for us to work across these communities, these portfolios, these congressional committees, that these issues really challenge us to do. And so a few words about kind of why I see that as being important, a few examples of how we're doing it. It's not something that we should give up on just because there are a lot of institutional barriers to doing it. So to tackle these problems, these connections between, say, natural resources development and security, it really does require that we have an integrated approach to our analysis, an integrated approach to our responses. So, for example, to look at climate change, which has been part of a discussion here, the kind of, again, the typical image is a developed country mega conference at the UN focusing on a climate change or a cap and trade discussion here. And I would suggest we need a much more diversified view of these issues and really bring that kind of 30,000-foot climate discussion down to what does it mean, what are the expected impacts we want to see in food and water in the Sahel and places that are critically important to us from a development or a security perspective, in South Asia, places that for a lot of other reasons we care about, and that these issues, as they play out in the more kind of on the ground, so to speak, in natural resources and they connect to livelihoods, are issues that we have to deal with. So in that sense, on climate change, a more diversified view would be one that we'd spend more time trying to understand adaptation. How are we going to deal with the expected impacts of these problems? As I said, playing out in issues like food and land and water and forests, and finding ways that we systematically, across some of these programs, lower vulnerability in communities and states and try to increase their resilience. And we'll find that some of those same mechanisms for doing that get you benefits in multiple sectors. And so by looking across them and being creative in how we respond to them, understanding the kind of multi-dimension of these problems, we have opportunities and more tools for trying to address them. Now, fortunately, we're in a time where integration, there's political space for integration and this kind of multi-dimensional approach. And my colleague John Sewell is going to talk a lot about the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, although the QDR, the Defense Review, has some of these elements in it as well. But with that and the Presidential Policy Directive on Global Development, we have explicitly a recognition that these things are connected and that development is appropriate in these security contexts. And my suggestion is part of that needs to be these natural resource issues as well. So finding ways that we work better across these stovepipes and bureaucracies is easy to say, but I want to give you a couple small examples of how we shouldn't just, if you spend enough time in DC, you know that it's difficult to do this stuff and work across bureaucracies and rice bowls and earmarks. And but nevertheless, I think the issues dictate that we do. So if we start with the analysis, so how do we find ways to do that? We had an experience that a couple of years ago, I guess just a year ago, where the specific part of AID that was focused on biodiversity said, okay, this is what we do, but we know there are a bunch of issues that really are going to affect biodiversity in Southeast Asia. And we don't have the time or the expertise, but we know we need to find out how trends in climate and energy and governance and trade and corruption are going to affect, say, Cambodian biodiversity and food security. So long story short, we put a bunch of different people together that don't usually talk. One of the insights from that process was we got the Tibetan Plateau glaciologists together with the downstream of the Mekong food security person responsible for programs in Cambodia, and they started to realize, while geographically very separate, while portfolios very separate, the expected impacts on glacial melt and seasonal snow melt for long, long way away in Tibet had really big implications for downstream years hence in Cambodia. And if they didn't take account of that process, then they were going to really, their development dollars were going to go to naught and could be literally washed away in future years. They responded with then a set of assessments that really tried to get a sense of the science and what that meant for their policy. So having these conversations across these lines can actually produce analysis that can then be put to work in how we decide what kind of development we're trying to support and how we do it. In another way that we're just starting to see evidence of doing within the U.S. government and other governments is trying to find, alluded to, essentially multiple benefits or triple bottom lines. So it turns out if you're worried about climate change, or you're worried about development, or you're worried about fragile states, that some of the same governance interventions, strong institutions in some of these fragile or weak states are going to be the ones that will get you benefits in these multiple sectors. And unless we're having the peace-building folks, the development folks, and the natural resource management folks that are connected to then yet really another community altogether, the climate people, together trying to capture that and bring those different views to our designing assistance policy in all those areas which we're doing at AID and the State Department, different parts of the government, then we're not capturing some of the benefits, and in some ways may even save some money in doing it by building some core institutions that are common to, again, places that we care about, whether it's the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, whether it's South Asia, places that for a lot of kind of geopolitical perspective is very important to us. I guess I will well, a couple other examples, but I'll just say in conclusion, kind of reading the papers this week, one of the, well, it's not a sport because it's obviously very serious business, but one of the things that you can find, everybody's making their special pitch for how to explain Tunisia, how to explain Egypt. And you know, it's multimedia, or the kind of power of social media, it's corruption, it's the kind of dramatic demonstration in Tunisia, the guy setting himself on fire, it's unemployment, it's a youth bulge. It's food prices, kind of historically high food prices. Just like we should be suspicious of anyone trying to give us a single causal explanation, these things are all at work. And they obviously are, there are approximate causes and there are underlying causes. My point today is that it behooves us to have this multidimensional understanding of the problems so that we can design our interventions to try to address the multiple underlying connected sets of issues where natural resources are really front and center as part of that discussion, not something that is kind of a luxury that we worry about when we get rich and democratic and peaceful. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. And Jeff's done an awful lot of work, both on development and on water and on health. And those are all, as he said, very important issues. Third speaker is Dr. Robert Lipvack, who's the Director of International Security Studies at the Center and also serves as Vice President for Programs. Rob?
Thank you, Mike. Good morning. I'll focus my remarks on recent developments relating to nuclear arms control and proliferation. But let me preface my comments by pull the optic back and look at the broader public policy debate and the contribution that the Woodrow Wilson Center makes to that debate. I think that a primary role of the center, and it's borne out in the comments of my two preceding colleagues, is that it provides a context for current public policy debates. That context can be historical, it can be cultural. It's a dimension to the debate that's often neglected in Washington. Social scientists distinguish between first-order questions and second-order questions. So much of the debate in Washington is about second-order questions, applied questions. For those of you working for congressional staff, it would be, should there be a new tranche of sanctions against Iran? Should the START Treaty be approved, ratified, or not? But underlying those so-called, so to speak, second-order questions are the first-order questions, the drivers of policies, the underlying assumptions, the key threshold assumptions that can have extraordinary downstream costs if you get it wrong. A recent book published by a fellow of the Wilson Center, Robert Jervis, the famous political scientist, did an analysis of the CIA's assessments on Iran before the revolution, published in a book, Intelligence Failures. He pointed to a central analytical flaw in CIA analysis that had huge consequences. It was an analytical flaw with major sort of dollar costs and political costs attached to it. The flaw was a tautology. The CIA was operating under the assumption that Iran was a stable country and would remain stable, that the lead indicator of instability would be the Shah cracking down in 1978-79. The failure of the Shah to crack down was viewed as an indicator that Iran was stable. So it was sort of a tautology operating in the intelligence community. It's an example of how a threshold assumption, a view of the world, can drive policy. We saw it yesterday played out on the Hill, where the intelligence community officials were being taken to task on, why didn't you predict Egypt was going to happen? Well, there are precipitants and there are kind of underlying determinants of policy. I'm sure if one looked back on the Egypt case, you'd see that the major elements of social instability would have been identified accurately by our intelligence community. Would, as the NSC spokesman said yesterday, could have anyone predicted that a Tunisian setting himself on fire would trigger a chain of events? No. I mean, George Kennan, whose uncle is the namesake of our Kennan Institute, in the X article, laid out a brilliant set of analysis, which was not only of strategy for the Cold War in the X article of 1947 that laid out the containment strategy, it was also a prophecy of how the Cold War could end. He argued that if the United States balanced Soviet power, that the internal contradictions of the Soviet Union would play out over time and lead to the collapse or the mellowing of Soviet society. He didn't predict it would occur in 1984 or 1989, but he just saw an underlying dynamic that would play out and lead to that was a key driver of policy. So I think when one looks at the analytical community, which we represent here, our contribution is sort of to identify what those factors are, and then how the relationship, so to speak, between the first order questions and the second order questions, so that those of you who are engaged in applied issues, should your member vote to approve the tranche of sanctions or not, kind of appreciate some of the underlying drivers of policy. When I worked on the National Security Council staff in non-proliferation, Pakistan had not yet gone overtly nuclear. But when in talking to colleagues, I asked what kind of study from the outside community would be useful to you. And they said, well, we don't need another widget study. We don't need a study telling us what in some facility outside of Islamabad can enrich to. What we could use is, like, where are these guys coming from? What is the strategic culture of Pakistan? Why do they think they need nuclear weapons? Now, that's the kind of contribution that outsiders can make. And there's a whole discussion about the role of open source and closed source, what constitutes strategic intelligence, what would really make a difference. And in the realm of strategic intelligence, that would really make a difference in how you assess the world, like Kim Jong-il is going to die in 3 months. That sort of game-changing kind of intelligence is rare. A lot of it can be done from open source, and I think that the role of the Wilson Center is to elucidate these key driving threshold assumptions, and then how they can play out in terms of applied decisions. And I think if one looks back at the history of American foreign policy, major failures that have had multi-billion, if not in certain cases trillion-dollar price tags, have come not from failures of our technology and our ability to kind of implement strategies, but rather in the assumptions that go into the strategies, the core threshold assumptions, and elucidating those and rigorously assessing them and doing it in a way where conclusions are not pre-cooked for the participants is, I think, what's distinctive about the Wilson Center vis-a-vis kind of other institutions in town, and what is our contribution. So if you take a look, for those of you who are members, covering non-proliferation issues, take 3 developments in the paper: ratification of START, the stalemate on Iran on the nuclear question, and the really disturbing headline in the Post and the Times that Pakistan is on a trajectory to eclipse Britain and France as being the 4th leading nuclear power. Okay, those are kind of the A1 section news headlines that your members might want to know about. Underlying those are key propositions that border on conventional wisdom, all of which need to be critically assessed. The core assumption after the Cold War that the risk of nuclear war between major powers is lower, but the risk of a single use of a nuclear weapon by a rogue state or a terrorist group has gone up. Secondly, and related to it, the corollary, that the greatest threat, and with the partisan divide, when you get presidential candidates with a D and an R on a podium, on a platform debating, there's concurrence that the greatest threat to the United States is a nuclear weapon in the hands of a terrorist group. There's a consensus on that, even with the partisan divide. And since 9/11, there's been concurrence in this country about the nexus of proliferation and terrorism, either a rogue state using or transferring a nuclear weapon to a terrorist group. That was the driving scenario behind the kind of the Iraq War. And third proposition bordering on conventional wisdom is that we're at a nuclear tipping point. That if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, that it will unleash a kind of cascade of proliferation. And that John Kennedy's nightmare scenario from 1962, that we live in a world of 30 or 35 nuclear weapon states, could be realized. So the role of the Wilson Center, it would be to assess current events, the three I mentioned, START, Iran, Pakistan, but to do so through the optic of looking at the kind of at what I've termed the threshold assumptions driving policy. Now, in each of these, and let me briefly comment because my time is running short. Let me just make a point about kind of Iran and terrorist acquisition. I think there's agreement after the START treaty was ratified that it reflects the conventional wisdom, the accurate conventional wisdom, that the risk of nuclear war between major powers is and remains low. Big question is China's modernization of strategic nuclear forces, but those forces are currently at a relatively low level, 90 ICBMs that are capable of reaching the United States. The Chinese have opted for a minimum deterrence program. But the question about the future of that program, the trajectory of it, START brought levels down to 1,550. How much lower can we go before you have to start bringing in other powers, Britain, France, China, into the equation? The other part of that conventional wisdom, that the risk of a single nuclear weapon going up is points to the issue of Iran and Pakistan. Now, Iran and Pakistan, and I'll wrap up on this and can elaborate in the discussion period, reflect two different routes of terrorist acquisition. There are three routes. A terrorist group could build a bomb, they could acquire a bomb through a transfer, or they could steal a bomb. Or there could be leakage. All right. Each of these routes. Building a bomb, we had a book from the head of the Las Vegas, the Nevada Test Center, is non-trivial. I can discuss kind of could terrorists, if they acquired material, build a nuclear bomb. There's a literature on that. But let me focus on the two routes: transfer and leakage. Iran and Pakistan. Much of our attention is focused on Iran. That Iran is categorized as a rogue state, and part of that the threat derives from the character of the regime is that the regime might transfer a nuclear weapon to a terrorist group that might use it against the United States. Either Iran would use it or they would transfer. There's a question about how one would deter that. States have return addresses. I think that the transfer scenario was addressed in the context of the Iraq War, and the National Intelligence Estimate in October 2002 stated that the one scenario under which Saddam Hussein would transfer a nuclear weapon to a terrorist group or an unconventional capabilities was a march on Baghdad if the regime felt it was about to collapse. That transfer dominates our thinking, but probably is the least likely route by which a terrorist group would acquire a nuclear weapon. Much more likely is leakage, and this really points us in a different direction, which I'll close on. Russia, which, like Willie Sutton says, that's where all the money is, that's where all the nuclear weapons and physical material is, and Pakistan. And here's, I think, the concern from Pakistan, that it's ramping up production of plutonium, and the size of its arsenal and questions about the security of that arsenal. You just had the governor of Punjab assassinated by one of his own guards. Real questions about the threat of leakage. So bottom line is, if a nuclear weapon were to go off in an American city and you had to handicap what's the source of origin, I would handicap it Pakistan, Russia, North Korea, Iran. That leakage, either from Pakistan or Russia, is much more likely in terms of materials and route of access than a state as an active, deliberate state policy transferring a nuclear weapon to a terrorist group, which has been the concern with North Korea and Iran. I've spoken telegraphically. I can develop any of these points during the discussion period.
Thank you, Rob. The last speaker is John Sewell, who's a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. John was for years, I believe, a quarter century, roughly, the president of the Overseas Development Council. He has written extensively on globalization and development issues. John.
Mike, thanks. In some ways, this is going to follow on very nicely to these three other presentations, and I will try and be just as short. All of you who are directly or indirectly engaged in Congress are going to be faced with a very important opportunity in the next 12 to 24 months. It's a major opportunity to focus both diplomacy and development on the major challenges that are going to face all of us in the first half of this century. These challenges are laid out, as Jeff DeBelko said, and the opportunities are laid out in this first ever Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, or the QDDR for short, which was released a few months ago by the State Department, in which, as we speak, the Secretary of State has all 100+ ambassadors from each U.S. embassy in Washington to be briefed on the meaning of the QDDR. It joins the Presidential Security Directive, which sets overall government U.S. policy in an interesting way. It's a document that deserves to be taken very seriously, despite the fact that it's 250 pages long, and the executive summary itself is fully 25 pages, because it lays out a major rethink of both American diplomacy and American development policy. And for many of you here, it's likely to involve congressional action of all various sorts before the debate is over. Much of what's in the QDDR is to be applauded. Conceptually, it aligns diplomacy and development as key and importantly equal priorities for U.S. foreign policy. Takes into account that the world has changed, that U.S. policies need to change with it. That's notably the rise of lots of other actors in the development business itself. South Africa has just opened a development program in many countries. The U.S. is by far and away the smallest provider of development assistance, and it certainly is dwarfed by private transactions of both trade and finance. It pledges to rebuild our development agency, USAID, as the preeminent global development institution with, for the first time in many years, new policy planning capacities, a heavy emphasis on evaluation and results, and a much diminished dependence on contractors for carrying out what aid does. Reorganizes the State Department to take on transnational issues such as economic growth, energy, climate change, and health and food, and it assigns new authorities to ambassadors to coordinate all U.S. government programs in their country, and makes the aid mission director the chief advisor to the ambassador. So this is a major change if it's put in place and if it succeeds. But it's worth remembering that it's not the first attempt to reform and realign U.S. development programs. The last major reform of U.S. development programs took place in 1961 when, looking around the room, I would guess there are an awful lot of people who weren't yet born in that period of time. Since that time, there have been 7 major attempts to reform development policy, and all of them have failed, partially or completely, and there are good reasons why they failed, and in the interest of time, if you want to ask about them, I'd be happy to talk for a little bit on why they all failed. The QDDR is now out. As I said, all U.S. ambassadors are being briefed on it as we meet here, but no one should ever underestimate the difficulty of implementing the QDDR, provided you can get through the 250 pages. It's not a propitious political climate, which I don't think needs any explanations. Importantly, there are major questions that are not answered. And let me just run through 6 of them briefly before I stop and open it up for questions. One is, it's really not clear who's in charge. There's a presidential study directive. It sets up a council in the White House. It's under the aegis of the NSC. On the other hand, the QDDR implies that it's going to coordinate all U.S. government programs, not just those that are under the aegis of the State Department. And it's not clear who's in charge. Secondly, is Congress on board? There was a lot of activity, bipartisan activity, in the last Congress to draft new legislation, which was put on hold while the Obama administration developed its policies, which resulted in the QDDR. It's a new Congress, obviously. I don't have to tell anyone that. And a short time ago, 165 of the new House Republicans proposed cutting AID's budget by 60 or 80%. The third issue is, can old dogs learn new tricks? The aid agency is rapidly moving quickly to reform itself and rebuild itself from what was a hollow shell, and has a dynamic new administrator. In fact, reorganizing aid, however, may be much easier than reorganizing the State Department, which traditionally has given priority to diplomacy and policy analysis. Managing programs, if you're in the State Department, is not the way to the top. And many attempts in the past have been made to change states' culture, but none have had a really major impact. The fourth and important question is, how do we make choices about what countries we give aid to? Well, I mean, there are some real horror stories. If I was a nasty congressman, I'd start raising questions about why we poured $11 billion into Egypt since 1979 and gotten the results we get today. That's a debater's question, not a serious question. But the QDR sets no criteria. Are we going to continue to put large sums of money into countries that aren't developing? Are we going to follow the choice of issues of food, environment, so on and so forth? It's a question which is not answered in any of these documents. 2 or 3 key policy issues are totally missing from the QDDR, and they're very important. One's the World Bank, which is the world's preeminent development agency. One is the IMF, which has had a major impact, which until recently was not very beneficial for the developing countries. And the third issue is trade, which is, of course, the third rail of American politics at the moment. But trade itself, trade liberalization, has a much greater impact on anything that happens in development than you're going to do with your aid program. And finally, the quintessential Washington question: who controls the budget? The budget is, the QDDR asserts that the current budgeting system must be streamlined and significantly revised. It's an admirable goal. But it implies that the aid administrator and the Deputy Secretary of State responsible for these issues will always agree. But in the real world, there's always very strong differences, both within the State Department and certainly between the Development Agency and the State Department about how the money is spent on what. And there's no indication from the QDDR about who reconciles them. Let me stop there. I would underscore to you that this is a very significant change if it's fully implemented. And it is a real opportunity. It's analogous to an issue that Rob Litwack knows a great deal about, to the famous directive in the late 1940s which set up the Defense Department. Took a long time, by the way, to implement that whole directive over several decades. But it's that kind of opportunity that you face now and that you'll be faced with in your NGO or congressional activities. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Okay, that's great. We've got a good half of the time to hear from you, questions, comments, and identify yourself and to whom you would like to address the question. The floor is open. There's a microphone that will come around. Yes, the lady in the middle over here.
Hi, my name is Natalie Fadish. I work for the Congressman in the Subcommittee for Africa, Global Health and Human Rights. And I have 2 questions for 2 different speakers. I would like to ask Jeff Dabelko to expand on the Africa examples, on how to really prepare ourselves for the impact that global change will have on Africa, and how to raise awareness here, especially now in the next in this session coming up, and to prepare ourselves so that we can already raise awareness now for what will actually be an impact on our aid policies in years from now. And more from a personal interest, I wanted to ask you, Robert Lichtweg. I wrote my graduate thesis actually on a very similar topic, on how assumptions impacted development policies in Afghanistan and state building specifically. And what I found is that it was crucial, but there's very little reflection once these policies are done, because it's actually institutionalized knowledge that's not questions anymore, that development aid and democracy on the little village will change the conflict, will blah, 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 blah. And so I found it really hard. I mean, for me it was wonderful research to do, but it was really frustrating to see that once these assumptions are institutionalized, there's just no questioning, and how do we go from what you're saying is that there's a problem that these assumptions are not questioned and they impact everything, our policy, well, you concentrate on nuclear, I concentrate on state building policies. So how do we connect back? Because people here on the Hill have so little work, so little time, so much work, so little time to really delve into these issues. And so we only take the briefing points, the talking points, that you give us, and how do we, question these assumptions in the end?
Very good question. Jeff, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you very much for the Africa question in terms of the climate, but within these larger issues. I think it's fair to say that we can see the most vulnerable, who are the least responsible for the climate change challenge, playing out in Africa. So the kind of African woman is the kind of least responsible for the climate problem and going to be probably affected the very most. What that suggests to me that is, at the same time, it also kind of comes off as absurd if you just kind of say climate change and then the plight of this kind of communities. It's the whole point is to understand it in terms of climate as a threat multiplier, making a whole set of really important challenges, whether climate is part of the question or not, but making them more difficult. And so I think in that sense, having a multidimensional response when one is talking about climate change adaptation in sub-Saharan Africa, to understand that some of the mitigation efforts and such, but the way we've been talking about this really has very little to do to speak to them in a direct context kind of today and in immediate years. And so finding ways, for example, to take advantage of places where there is a lot of support, such as in the administration and in both parties, on the Hill in terms of support for women and girls. And understanding that having a multidimensional strategy to increasing their resilience and lowering their vulnerability is one that comes from multiple sectoral interventions. So you mentioned health as well as the kind of natural resources, and finding ways that can, some of those empowerment strategies for women and girls that we would like to do for a whole host of reasons are also part of that discussion. Typically they've been seen as very separate. And I think that's really to the disadvantage of trying to have this multidimensional approach and lower that vulnerability across sectors, so that when these additional stresses that are anticipated with climate change can come into play. We could also talk about examples in terms of anticipated changes in water availability and what that means on local levels, but also in transboundary settings. We could talk about anticipated additional stresses around sustained droughts and desertification and what that means in terms of making conflicts between essentially two kinds of farmers, pastoralists and agriculturalists, more difficult to solve. And again, unpacking some of the conditions. There are lots of reasons why Sudan has had the conflict challenges it has had, but part of telling that story is underlying a notion that those kinds of pastoralist versus agriculturalist conflicts have become more difficult, and then with a regime in Khartoum willing to take advantage of them, it really gets us to some of the really dark places that those conflicts have had. Again, those are kind of two very different examples, but are hopefully illustrative of how bringing these multiple dimensions can have you get a more nuanced understanding of the challenges that we face.
Rob, do you want to?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I tried to tee up and didn't have time to really fully develop two of the kind of conventional wisdoms that are driving policy on the nuclear side now. The first being the sort of the nexus of proliferation and terrorism, and the second being the tipping point argument with Iran. And I could just say, sort of parenthetically, that North Korea is an interesting case empirically, where it did cross the nuclear threshold, and there's not been a cascade of proliferation in East Asia yet with Japan and South Korea. So as we look at the Iranian case, which is country-specific and region-specific, we can draw on, and that's another dimension of the Wilson Center's activities, sort of comparative work across regions and trying to draw accurate and apt analogies across historical periods and regions. The crux of your question really gets to sort of like what Senator, the patron saint of the Wilson Center, the founder, and I'm paraphrasing him, the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said, how you think about the world shapes how you act in the world. And kind of the point, the one, as they would say in the Pentagon, takeaway from or a takeaway from my presentation was just sort of trying to relate ideas and actions, and how what the Washington Post calls the ideas industry kind of has a role in this. And I wouldn't overstate the role. We have funders who say to us we wouldn't have an impact on policy. There's senators that don't have an impact on policy, but I think what outsiders can do is try to, whether it's universities or research institutes, try to clarify the thinking, what the Saturday Night Live character called stinking thinking. Unfortunately, usually when you go into a meeting and it's about, like, what's this meeting about? It's about Iran sanctions, and you say, well, wait a minute, what's going on with these guys? And try to look at some of the societal, a refrain from the senior policymaker can be, as I heard a word used, look, we don't have time to talk about theology. We're here to make a decision about kind of what are we doing tomorrow. And I think I've had, kind of reflecting on the treadmill and other places on this sort of this question of the relationship between the mission of the Wilson Center, ideas and action. I think you can look at conditions under which ideas can kind of change. Okay, one factor is a key factor is timing. When the Cold War ended, there was no obvious kind of successor sort of structure of security and political relations in Europe. Policymakers, and I recall I was at the Wilson Center, we held some meetings on, like, what's the future security and political architecture for Europe? And in that case, there's receptivity because there's no inertia. I mean, everything's changed. There's been a point of discontinuity. So the policymakers are receptive to an issue, to kind of outside ideas. Other times, the policies proceeded to the point where they're not going to revisit some of the kind of first order considerations, as I would put it. Take the mid-1990s in the Balkans. The academic literature was putting out, one line was focusing on partition scenarios, and they looked historically where, going back to World War II, World War I, where populations have been physically separated, and looked at partition as a route to political stability in the Balkans. Well, unfortunately, the United States at that point was several years committed to the proposition of a multi-ethnic Bosnia-Herzegovina. So if someone comes in and says, hey, let's partition everyone, they'll say, are you crazy? That move is off the chess table. We are just so far beyond the possibility of partitioning. So an idea can just be, as I would call it, off the chess table. And then there's so timing is critical, but also receptivity of the policymaker. And this is sort of reason 1,000,000,009 why political science is not a science, that it tries to account for through its theories of, that it can explain Thomas Jefferson, Golda Meir, and Adolf Hitler. It just doesn't, the role of the individual is critical. And we've had presidents, the decider was famous for not, like, revisiting these issues, that they were locked in on it. And a senior Carter administration official said if someone had come into Carter's office and said in 1977, Iran's going to blow, there's going to be a revolution, they would have been thrown out of the office because the president would have said, are you kidding me? I'm dealing with the then SALT treaty, I'm dealing with inflation, I've got all these problems crowding it out. Iran right now, the CIA assumption that Iran is stable until something happens and then the Shah will crack down. That was sort of the prevailing mode. So all this by way of saying that there are kind of determinants of when ideas can vector into it, into the process, and when policymakers kind of lock themselves out, so to speak, and they're not in receptive mode. And you can look back historically, kind of the literature that came out on the Vietnam War, the role of George Ball, so if you were president, I think one useful thing for the president would be, just as the Roman emperor, had a slave behind him sort of whispering in his ear as he's receiving accolades, don't let this, essentially in Latin, don't let this go to your head. The president should have someone, kind of a court dissenter, who will kind of raise some of these considerations. And it's particularly acute because often the hardest challenges are discontinuities. And discontinuities by nature not part of a linear kind of policy extrapolation. So it's very, it's not the law of thermodynamics. I would commend to you, I shared it with my colleagues here, and this will be my last word on this, the op-ed by Ross Duhat in the New York Times this week, in the op-ed page, in which he says, history makes fools of us. We go through life, and we have to acknowledge that we have ideas. We can call it liberal internationalism or realpolitik or whatever, and we sort of use and shape and govern the world. But the world is just, he says, too untidy and too tragic to kind of fit into these theories, that you make a decision, and in one context it'll work out, in another it won't. And that's not a prescription for throwing up our hands and not trying to kind of put it through a rigorous process, but just a kind of a note of humility of what is kind of reasonably, what is reasonable in this realm of how ideas and policies sort of interact.
Yes. Yep. Put your hand up if you have a question, and I'll make sure you're. Yeah.
Sorry for that long answer. So I'll make it short.
Thank you very much. All very interesting presentations. My name is Sarah Williams. I'm from AAAS. My question is for Dr. DeBelco. I'm curious if you could go into a little detail about sort of how you would prioritize the different issues within, this, field or issue area, whatever we want to call it, because there's things sort of, especially, with the new Congress and sort of what's possible in the political sphere, because issues in this area range from, how do we fuel our military that's at war, all the way down to food security and water scarcity and migration issues. And obviously different, these sort of are relevant in different parts of the world and, for different reasons. And so I'm just curious if you have a sense of the prioritization process and what might go into that decision making on your part.
Okay, thanks, Sarah, for the easy question. Obviously, this is where one has to get to in terms of priorities. I think before making the hard choices, it's a bid to at least do the integrated analysis and understand how these interact, and in some ways how it's really appealing and certainly easier to get a funding line and easier to have an organized office to have just a Feed the Future initiative or just a water initiative or just a climate change initiative. And we have two of the three of those are presidential level, and the other is kind of just under it, right, in terms of those. Now, how can you talk about agriculture without talking about water? How can we talk about water without really understanding what the climate change impacts for that are going to be? So in some ways, it's a bid for mainstreaming so that we don't get ourselves into situations where we're making, say, food investments based on assumptions that don't pay attention to the long-term water availability forecasts in, say, the Sahel or in larger parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Not suggesting that we're doing that, but there have been certainly plenty of instances over time where we've had either a time frame challenge or a lack of integration challenge, and so that our efforts are delivering results that are less than what they can be. I think obviously there is merit in things that have immediate impacts, and those merits come in part because they're maybe easier to get support for, but also because you can see results from. Something that we shouldn't underestimate how important how impatient we are to see results. I mean, these, as John has pointed out, these development efforts have gone on for a very long time, many of which, if we're talking about these natural resources, food, water, these are long-term things, right? The kind of our typical, at best, two-year timeline for grant assistance is going to show, is going to be a start, but not a finish. And so in that sense, it's, I think it's incumbent on, if we're going to go with a single sector, that those sectors are better integrating the other. And, so the kind of immediacy of some of the food and the water ones then are appealing. And of course, this is why it's difficult to get things done on climate, because it's long-term, it's diffuse, there's always going to be uncertainty in terms of how it plays out. But I think we have enough to know that if we don't find ways to go on concurrent tracks. And so I think there are going to be ones that get the prominence, and the question is how well can those integrate, even if the kind of name on the door is food or the name on the door is water. If those initiatives are done in ways that bring into those other considerations, then they can be presented as an advantage of multiple benefits and greater prospects for sustainability and success, rather than a competition that we saw, certainly in early years of PEPFAR around AIDS versus other public health priorities and such, and we can try to avoid some of those. So I hope that's not completely punting on your question to say that we have to take them all into consideration, but thank you.
Thanks. Gentleman on the aisle here.
Good morning. Thank you. My name is Sean Bin. I'm actually with the Canadian Forces College in Toronto, and so I wanted to come down to experience climate change for the last couple of days because it's a little cold up there. I don't want Jeffy to dominate the discussion here, but I do have just one quick question, maybe a bit of a follow-up to the last question there about when we start to talk about these actions. I want to talk a little bit about coordinating global responses to these as opposed to just a single country like the United States looking at these. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on the state of how much coordination larger countries like the United States are looking to other developed nations in the world to start focusing on some of these mitigation actions. For instance, food security issues, looking at research into drought-resistant seeds that can address, mitigate the actions in places like the Sahel to actually try to take the multiple prongs that you comment on and trying to prioritize that, by maybe trying to sort of specialize with other nations out there in order to maybe address these things on a more global scale as opposed to a single nation scale. Thank you.
Well, this is a question I'm sure my other colleagues will have good responses to as well. I can start and say that in some ways we have almost countervailing desires within this kind of the administration within USG, in the sense that there has been a sharp distinction made with this administration as opposed to the previous one, that the United States should be engaged, and it's necessary for us to achieve our goals to be engaged internationally in international institutions and with partners in bilateral and multilateral relationships. On the other hand, of course, the way that we engage is in part based on coming back to, does this meet our national interests? And then it encourages the kind of default is a bilateral rather than a multilateral approach. I think there are some examples, and John certainly would have a long history in knowing about, on the development side, those kinds of collaborations in the kind of regional context in Latin America. I think we see the need to do it, but we're not necessarily doing it very well yet. Ironically, especially given where you're coming from, so to speak, the military may be one of the ones that are doing it in some ways better than some of our civilian side, although there are activities in both of those areas. So I think there's now the kind of recognition for the need to do it, and now it's finding ways to do it, and finding ways to do it where, unfortunately, still for large constituencies, multilateralism and the UN are a difficult political sell, and that's too bad, because I think the kind of inherent case of the various interdependencies and the challenges and being kind of too big for any one country dictate that we have to go that route, and we need to find ways to do it better. But perhaps others have.
John, do you want to add anything there, or Cindy?
No, I think, let me just be very brief. And I'll say something that may seem counterintuitive here, and I may sound like Voltaire's Candide, who believed everything was the best of all possible worlds. But the reality is, at least on my perspective, the world's an awful lot better off than it was. Doesn't mean we don't have lots of problems. People live longer. Major countries that were termed basket cases no more than 4 decades ago are feeding themselves. Our major competitors in the world economy, and I can go on with a very long list. Trouble is, of course, it gets you a new set of problems that you have to deal with. And I think it's useful, based on what my colleagues were saying, to think about the difference between problems and issues. There are lots of problems around. We can get a list of 100 in a few minutes here of problems that are real problems, but nobody's paying attention to them. When a problem becomes an issue, as climate change has become, it's very important. But climate change, in a sense, is the quintessential example of the problem, because there's no agreement either on the causes of the problem or what to do about it, and there are a great number of vested interests that are opposing any real change. Now, there are lots of examples of areas where we cooperate globally on all sorts of issues. Think of early warning of new diseases, which has happened in the last 2 or 3 decades. And the real issue, the real challenge as you look at it, is you've got to move policymakers to think that the costs of action are lower than the costs of inaction. Because it's very easy, if you're a political leader or a congressman or whatever, not to take action. when the costs of action are much higher than the perceived cost of the benefits. And you've got to get climate change to that particular issue. There are lots of examples. I mean, we don't have the time to go into a long discussion of the development business. The development business has made a number of huge mistakes. We've learned a great deal from them. A great deal of money has been spent and wasted. If you wander through any developing country, there are the shells of very good aid projects, which not just U.S. aid, which have been abandoned for various reasons, and so on and so forth. People now understand that better and are changing their policies, and the new aid administrator understands that better than most people. And there will be a change in policies. It is possible, but it's tough. And for people in elective positions in an open democracy, they're even tougher because the costs of action may be higher than people perceive the benefits.
Cindy, you want to add to that?
Sure. Slightly on a different tack, but to take up the central theme of the relationship between development and security. One concrete issue that will be before the Congress has to do with funding for the extension of the Merida Initiative from focused on Mexico into Central America, the so-called CARSI program and the related CBSI. And I'd just like to sort of leave on the table that the best response to drug trafficking, to organized crime, to youth gangs is not only law enforcement, it's also prevention. And it's, very fashionable in a time of budget cutting, to cut back AID budgets and to reduce the amount of development assistance that the United States gives. But I don't think it's rocket science to show that there is a very, very strong correlation between the absence of jobs for young people, the absence of good schools for young people, and their propensity to integrate into youth gangs and other forms of illicit activity. So that, ultimately the response, or one of the key components of a response to the surge in organized crime and drug trafficking in Central America, only in part as a result of the crackdown in Mexico, because there have been dynamics, I think, underway for a long time that are very specific to those Central American countries. But one aspect of the response has to be a development policy. There are very important law enforcement components. It's always easier, I think, to interest people in funding when it's posed in terms of a security threat. But there's really no long-term solution to the problems of youth gangs and their growing interconnections with organized crime in Central America and the Caribbean than coupling this with a strong development policy and a prevention policy that relies on kind of strong institutions to provide social and economic inclusion. I think it's notable that El Salvador is one of the 4 countries that has been identified as a priority, for the State Department in terms of development assistance. I think it explains why now that President Obama is going to Latin America in the month of March, El Salvador is one of the countries that's included, because I think, to go back to something that Rob said, where leadership makes a difference, you do have a government that is very keen on doing this, that is committed to doing something, and I think the commitment of the political leadership, is an important component. So I would just urge you, when these requests from AID, for funding for Central America and for CARSI and for CBSI, that you think broadly in terms of the multiple components that will contribute to addressing an intractable and perhaps unresolvable problem in Central America, but one that nonetheless we cannot afford to ignore.
And one that we see on our doorstep here in other manifestations. Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you all for your comments. I just want to change the topic a little bit. I was wondering if you could briefly address any change in the situation or any change in focus that you might foresee for Southeast Europe, to include the Balkans, Fyrom, Greece, and even possibly Cyprus. So this might be a question for Mr. Litwick.
in NATO parlance, that's sort of an out-of-area question for me. So, I think that, Greece has been kind of a focal point of the economic crisis in Europe, and I think that the crisis in the Eurozone really kind of points to the need for the reshaping of the international economic architecture to be able to accommodate kind of a 21st century economy. And it's ironic to have the president of China come to the United States and sort of lecture us and say that calling for greater regulation so that capitalism and the free market kind of model that the United States advanced would not be prone to the type of crisis that one saw in 2008. And we've got kind of an expert in the room who's not on the panel, Kent Hughes, who runs our program on America and the global economy. Who could, I think you covered that last week. So I think that kind of rethinking an international architecture, kind of regulatory architecture, financial architecture is a topic that's at the heart of the G20 agenda. It's one that we've addressed in our programming. We have an active a European program which pays special attention, in fact, to Southeast Europe. So I'd commend you to look at some of the programming that we've done for kind of additional information.
We do have a European studies program that spends a lot of time on Southeast Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean region. Yes, the woman from AAAS.
Sarah.
If nobody else, yes, okay. Oh, good. Okay, I see 3 more hands. Yes. Yeah, the lady in front over here in the red coat.
Just a question for Cindy. Thanks for bringing up the prevention element as we look at the rising insecurity in Mexico, Central America, et cetera. And I wanted to hear your comments on how are both aid and trade policy, because I like the comment that trade has often more of an impact than aid on employment, et cetera, livelihoods in a region. How can we focus that in a way that A, contributes to improved governance, strengthening of institutions, and to improved livelihood opportunities? And I think of, for example, Mexico, where I think at the outset of NAFTA there was this idea that this would lead to rising employment, this would lead to sort of this, Mexico is on the path to better development and better institution building, et cetera, and now we look at Mexico as one of the areas where we see, extreme insecurity and again, low indices of support for democracy, et cetera. So what can we learn over the past decade or so of our engagement with Latin America that could help us be better partners in development and security going forward?
Well, it's a big question. There's a great deal of concern in the development community that focuses on Latin America with the so-called NEE, which means neither the young people who are neither in school nor have jobs, and I think that one of the central tasks, both in Mexico and in Central America, not only to solve issues of youth violence but also to stem the sort of push factors behind immigration, is to create good jobs in the formal sector. And trade agreements are very important in doing that, but they're not the only answer. And there has been an expansion of U.S. Central American trade as a result of the Central America Free Trade Agreement. How many jobs have been created in Central America as a result, as opposed to jobs in the United States, I think is somewhat an issue of dispute. But there's no question that it has been a contributing force. Another aspect of this is to get the private sectors in those various countries to see the problems of youth violence as a problem of the society and not just a problem that is resolved by hiring private security guards or building bigger walls around your home. So a kind of integral approach that looks not just at investments in crime. Crime prevention programs are often thought of as building a community center or constructing, as they did in Medellin in Colombia, libraries in poor neighborhoods. I mean, job creation is really at the heart of this. And so coming to sort of consensus around a macroeconomic policy that will foster economic growth, but at the same time foster a sense of commitment on the elites in those societies that paying taxes is an important thing to do. Because without sort of fiscal resources, the state is not able to make the kinds of investments. So that the contribution from the international community has to be coupled with a contribution, from the private sectors of those countries. And to me, I think it's really discouraging that, something like now we're, 15 years since the signing of the peace accords in El Salvador that had as a central goal the raising of the tax burden to 12% of GDP, that the efforts to, promote that kind of increase in tax revenue were repeatedly rejected by the Congress, opposed tooth and nail by the private sector, and Guatemala remains at the bottom, of the list of countries in the region in terms of the contribution of tax revenue. So there's lots and lots of things that have to be changed, but I think that employment creation in the formal sector, not the informal sector, has to be a key component of any sort of long-term resolution of this. Now, AID cannot do that alone. AID can provide resources that will provide sort of better schools, but these are kinds of responsibilities and obligations that have to be assumed by the countries themselves. I don't know if that answers what you're looking for.
And let the record show that Cindy is a strong supporter of the Colombian Free Trade Agreement and the Panama Free Trade Agreement.
Absolutely, and you guys should do something quick because this is it's a real loss of an opportunity. If I could just address that briefly, particularly in Colombia, there have been long-standing and very legitimate concerns over human rights and over labor rights issues, but at some point there has to be a recognition that that there has been progress and there will continue to be progress, and that withholding the free trade agreement is something that hurts the United States ultimately, I would say more politically than economically. I think what we have to do, if people are concerned about the erosion of democracy and the resurgence of so-called radical populism in Latin America, it's a no-brainer that the United States has to see the Latin American countries that have strong economies, that have macroeconomic stability, that have a commitment to social policy as strategic allies of the United States. Because frankly, the United States is losing out. China is probably the most dynamic outside player. Countries such as Brazil and Chile now trade more with China than they do with the United States. The growing sort of coherence in economic development of countries in South America has led them to just broaden, the range of foreign policy partners. And, the United States is just going to be left in the dust. And I think we've gotten to a point where it just doesn't make any sense anymore to withhold those free trade agreements, because we'll continue to withhold them and everybody's just going to go elsewhere. And then we're going to look around and say, how is it that, the United States lost influence in the region? Well, part of it, was our own doing. Another part of it was the sort of natural, tendency on the part of emerging powers and on the part of countries that have developed and stabilized their democracies and stabilized their economies to have enough sort of domestic capacity and coherence to want to, multiply their own partners in the world. That is something that the United States cannot affect. But the United States can also choose not to play a role, and I think that's exactly what's happening.
I think there was a question way in the corner, and there was one other question on this side that I don't know who had it.
Good morning. Stephen Rona from Congressman Peter Rossum's office. Similar question along these lines. I'm very much so interested in your thoughts on what the role of the U.S. involvement should be, and as well as our foreign policy on states in flux such as Tunisia, Egypt, as well as Iraq, and their transitions into democracies and in their current state of being an illiberal democracy. and how the past our involvement within Latin American transitions should or should not be applied to these states.
Rob, you're on.
Cindy, do you want to start
Or do you want
that?
to talk about democratic transition?
In Latin America and what we did right and wrong? And is it applicable elsewhere?
Boy, that is a really, really big question. Because I know what I read in the New York Times about Tunisia and Egypt, so I'm not gonna make those leaps. But I think the United States played a significant role, not only in consolidating dictatorship during a certain period of the Cold War in Latin America, but also later on in fostering and supporting human rights and the democratic transitions. And a lot of that impulse came, frankly, from the Congress and was opposed, by the administration. And I think that pressure to improve human rights, to improve democratic standards, the conditioning of assistance, of trade, of whatever levers exist, was an important component. If you look at the democratic transition, in Chile, the Reagan administration in its second term, which certainly during the Central American years, many of us would have considered, an administration that did not have human rights at the center of foreign policy, played an important role in supporting the idea of free elections and indicating to the Pinochet government that its days were numbered and it had to cede, to popular demand for democracy. Now, again, you had democratic transitions that took place in an evolutionary way, and that's a marked contrast from what's taking place now in the Middle East. And so I'm not sure that there are many lessons to be learned from Latin America, where the process was much more gradual and much more a combination of pressures long-term within for political space on the part of very coherent political oppositions, and a combination of a positive response and a supportive response from the international community. Now, how you deal with the kind of crisis that exists now, in Egypt, I'm not sure that Latin America provides you with any guideposts, but the lesson or the takeaway is pretty much the same lesson that was learned after the debacle in Vietnam and attempted to sort of move forward by the Carter administration, which is that when you support sort of repressive governments because they are apparently stable in the interest of security, you wind up with a big mess on your hands. And that's what happened in Nicaragua, and it's what happened, frankly, throughout Central America, and turning it, you can never look into sort of the crystal ball and know what the future is going to hold. But what Rob was saying is that you have to look more broadly at the dynamics of change within societies and stay ahead of the curve and stay on the side of evolutionary democratic change, because if you're not on that side long-standing, you get swept away. And I think that's, definitely the lesson of what took place in Nicaragua. That the U.S. efforts to sort of broker a transition from the Somoza government were completely overtaken by events, and the armed solution by the Sandinistas, just became the dominant force for removing Somoza. So, I think back to what was, we have the Article X by George Kennan. There's also what I consider is almost prophetic testimony in 1979 by the Assistant Secretary of State at the time, Pete Vakey, who's in retirement, retired State Department official, which, was essentially saying that, if you make peaceful evolutionary change impossible, what you get is radical revolutionary change. And, that's as much, the days of the Cold War are over in Latin America. The days of armed insurrections are for the most part over. But what is still there as a response to the failure to incorporate people politically and incorporate people in a socioeconomic way is radical populism. And, you know, if you're concerned about democracy and you're concerned about, you know, preventing, you know, a multiplication of situations in which the institutions of liberal representative democracy are destroyed, then you need to care about political inclusion and socioeconomic inclusion. So again, how much of that, you know, gives you a guidepost for addressing the upheaval that exists now in Egypt, you know, I'm not sure. But the long-term message, I think, is be on the side of evolutionary change and of inclusion in all respects.
Just to add a...
Can I add two things to that in a minute?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was too. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. If you got a quick comment.
Two quick comments. After the end of the Cold War and the independence of the Eastern European states, there was a very useful and easy dialogue between the Latin Americans and the Eastern Europeans. The Eastern Europeans learned from them on the Latin American experience. That's one comment. The second comment is, of course, one of the great inducements for maintaining a democracy in those same countries of Eastern Europe was the prospect of joining the EU with all of the benefits that flowed therefrom. If you were not a democracy, you were cut off from those. Democracy is the criteria for joining the EU. And that enabled forces within countries to say, well, look, you know, if you overthrow the government, you will soon find that you lose all the potential goodies that you're going to get out of association with the EU, which, of course, had a political weight in their own countries, which was not inconsiderable.
I just might add that in 1965, the per capita income in Asia and the per capita income in the Middle East was identical. In 1995, 30 years later, the per capita income in Asia had more than quadrupled. And with all of the oil, the per capita income in the Middle East had not doubled. This region has paid an enormous price for the deficiency of their governments. And we are, unfortunately, and probably fortunately, actually more than unfortunately, we are not a major influence on what's going to play out in Cairo, the United States. And that's a hard fact, but I think it is an accurate fact. We had, yes, in the blue, and then there was one more in front here.
Just along the vein, my name is Michael, work for Mr. Blumenauer. Along the vein of U.S.-Iran policy, just what you foresee coming down the road. Talks, again, obviously weren't very successful. I don't think anybody had any big hopes. Kind of see a track towards arming the Gulf states at a sort of unprecedented rate, Saudi Arabia and other things, as sort of a containment policy for Iran. Is this a responsible foreign policy, especially when we're talking about supporting supposedly stable states?
Great question. I think that the Obama administration's sort of critique of the Bush administration was that the Bush administration on the nuclear question had sent a mixed message, whether the U.S. objective was to change the regime in Tehran or to change its conduct, and that this mixed message was a complicating factor in the diplomacy. It wasn't clear whether the United States was willing to take yes for an answer from Iran if it came clean on its nuclear program. The Obama administration, if you look at the National Security Strategy document, you know, which rubric is comprehensive engagement, they keep talking about the need to make a choice, that the United States has teed up a choice for Iran, that it can either integrate into the international community or it can accept the downside of continuing to flout international norms with respect to nonproliferation, the punitive side. And I think that really gets to the crux of the issue for Iran, which is that the nuclear issue is a reflection of the domestic turmoil in the country. It's a surrogate for debates going on in the country and makes it particularly thorny. I'm not an expert on that. We have Halas Fandiari, director of the Middle East program. We've had countless meetings that look at the linkages, the subtle and complex linkage between Iran's domestic foreign policy and domestic policies and its foreign policies. I've worked just on the nuclear non-proliferation, you know, piece of it. I think that the Obama administration has teed up what I would call a structured choice with a real upside for Iran and a substantial downside through multilateral sanctions. And the critique of the Obama administration is sort of the the flip of the Bush administration criticism. For Bush, the criticism was, will he take yes for an answer? And the rap on Obama is, will he take no for an answer? That the United States has teed up the choice, which I think is what all we can do is play out our hand. And I think the Obama administration has responsibly teed up that choice. But there may not be a deal there. And this just, if I can, in kind of 1 minute, this just sort of goes to the theme of my remarks, which is the relationship between underlying assumptions and what I call the second order questions of the policy options: containment, engagement. If you look at each of the policy prescriptions, an op-ed, say if you're working for a member, he sees an op-ed, says, let's bomb Iran, let's contain Iran, let's whatever. Each of these options rest on critical threshold assumptions. The bomb options rest on the assumption that Iran is essentially a crazy state, that the character of the regime is such that mere acquisition of nuclear weapons is unacceptable, and therefore the United States should bomb Iran to deny it these capabilities. A variant on the bomb option is that, and someone from the American Enterprise Institute has argued this, that it would be the starting gun of a counter-revolution. That if we, in the Pentagonese, we lit up Natanz, that this would be the starting gun of a counter-revolution. Huge threshold assumption about domestic politics in Iran. Take the containment options. There are two variants. Targeted sanctions, the underlying assumption is if you squeeze the elite, they'll feel the pressure and they'll alter course. A variant is general sanctions, such as we did with Iraq. The assumption is you squeeze the general population, that political pressure will be channeled to the top who will make the change. Then you have the engagers, so to speak, of those who feel that there is a deal there, but the United States has not offered big enough carrots yet, and we just need to come up with the right carrots, and then they'll accept the deal. And there's this bifurcation between those who think that there is a deal there and those who feel there is no deal there. My sense is that Iran has reached its sweet spot, which is it's created a hedge option for itself by mastering uranium enrichment. This is not a crash program to get a nuclear weapon as fast as possible. It's not Los Alamos, like we need a bomb because Adolf Hitler may get a bomb in 1943 to 45. This is not a crash program, but it's determined, it's incremental. And the Iranians are savvy. The country invented chess. They can see what the regional complications would be if they went overtly nuclear. I think that the United States can fall back on a traditional playbook, which is we don't live in a world of 35 nuclear weapon states. And a major reason for that is the extended deterrent umbrella that the United States provided in the Cold War to countries like Germany, which were really on the front line, and which Secretary Clinton has flagged with respect to Saudi Arabia. So that sort of feeds into the containment option. But I just wanted to cite your question to kind of come back to kind of the mission of the Wilson Center in terms of like identifying, elucidating, and critically assessing the assumptions that go into policy.
Part of your question, the last question will be this lady in front, but go ahead and bring it up. I just say part of your question, I think, had to do with Saudi Arabia and selling them a whole lot of arms and all that kind of thing. The policy since, I think, Carter has been that the United States needs to have an over-the-horizon presence in the Persian Gulf on an ongoing basis. And the entire population of Saudi Arabia is about the size of the greater Tehran region of Iran. And no matter what we sell to Saudi Arabia, if there's an invasion, they will need help.
Mr. Litvak, briefly, why would you include Russia in the same breath with Pakistan, North Korea, and Iran in your discussion of leakage?
Not because of the character, the character regime, which under, Putin and Medvedev is sort of authoritarian, but, as I sort of telegraphically said, citing Willie Sutton, because that's where the money is. The large stockpiles of fissile material and weapons are in the Soviet Union, which is an enormous kind of nuclear kind of industry and nuclear infrastructure. So that's just the size, the magnitude of the program, and the magnitude was such that in the early 90s, Congressman Les Aspin spearheaded what now becomes the Nunn-Lugar, program, cooperative threat reduction, to kind of and as the President Obama has affirmed, and Obama wants to take the Nunn-Lugar program and make it global, to lock down fissile material so it cannot fall into the wrong hands. So I include Russia into that just because of the amount of material there and questions about the security over those materials and the possibility that criminal organizations or terrorist groups could acquire it. What they could do with it if they acquired it is a separate question. And I alluded to one of our fellows who actually designed nuclear weapons, who runs the Nevada test site, who has argued in his new book, Nuclear Weapons: A History, that it's beyond the ability of a terrorist group to actually fabricate a nuclear weapon. If they acquire the material, they would need the infrastructure of a state. That's a debatable point, but it's out there as sort of one position. But that's why I included Russia, not to kind of link, compare the character of the ruling regimes to North Korea or Iran, certainly.
I want to thank all of my colleagues, and I want to thank you for being very attentive and asking some very good questions. I know we have a program next week with an MIT professor, and I believe David Klaus would like to talk to that and other future events.
All right. Thank you. I'm David Klaus, the consulting director of the Wilson Center on the Hill program. You've just been at the second of two programs we try and do at the beginning of each year, in which we look at foreign policy challenges for the coming year and sort of the breadth of those things. From now on, for the rest of the year, we're going to try and tackle them one at a time. We have not yet firmly set the next two programs, but I think you may want to write down on Friday the 11th. We're just finalizing putting together a program looking at Egypt and what's going on in that part of the world and its implications for U.S. energy security. And that's a program that's tentatively being set for well, if it's going to happen, it'll happen on the 11th at a lunch hour. And then also Tuesday the 22nd, we're working on another program which will look at this whole breadth of what China's doing on its renewable energy incentives and programs. And as many of you know, there's been a lawsuit by our trade case that the steelworkers have tried to bring. And so we're going to try and bring some of the steelworker folks in and talk about that, but also some trade lawyers, and we'll talk a little bit about what policies may have worked, what may or may not be legal, consistent with U.S. trade policy. So my suggestion is, if you've not done so already, leave your name, card, email address with Liz Byers. And what we'll do is you'll be on our email list for future programs, and we look forward to seeing you through the rest of the year. One final thanks to the Committee on Government Reform and Oversight for letting us use the room. And also, I don't know if Mike mentioned at the beginning, we're able to do this at the Wilson Center and this whole program because we get a grant from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, which enables us to take the time and effort to do these programs. So thank you once again for attending.
Thank you, David.